And God is leading you, and God is leading me. I rest in that. Last evening, we got Abraham and I'm fully aware, for those of you that are joining us late, that it is Abram at this point, or Abram. I told the first night, I have studied Hebrew. I've watched Fiddler on the Roof about 4 or 5 times, and I know it's Abram. But I can't, it's just, he's Abraham to me, and he always will be, and I'm not going to try to keep that distinguished. But we got him back out of Egypt, back into Canaan, where he had been at the beginning. And I think we're reaching a turning point in Abraham's life, spiritually. Abraham was a man, we've learned, who wasn't perfect. He didn't always make the right decision when distractions came. He sometimes, as in last evening, made wrong decisions, which set a direction, which led him to a destination. But a faithful God was active in redemption and brought him back. The final story, the final phrase of this man is in James, where it says, he believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. We're learning how to become the friend of God. And we're realizing that the way that happens is through the cycles of life, which I suggested to you last night. Life is a series of cycles of first being called by God and responding to that. And once we respond and begin that journey, there are distractions along the way. And that was, of course, the focus of last night's message. We come this morning to chapter 13 again, and a distraction, another distraction. But I believe Abraham is drawing upon the mistakes made, the faithfulness of God, and he said, I'm tired of living the way that I've been living. It's time I trusted God in some situations. And today, he does that. I hope you're turning some corners in your spiritual walk with God. I'm a little anxious about the series, the topic that we come to and the narrative this morning, because it's on conflict, and some of you, maybe not quite to your conflict is, what do I wear today? Well, it's a little deeper than that. And I'm not talking down to you, but as you get more responsibilities and you have positions of influence, you realize that there's going to be conflict. And so you may not be able to understand this totally. Some things you have to experience first before you understand it. It's kind of like the guy who was walking by this mental health facility, and there was a high wooden fence around it, and he's on the sidewalk, and on the other side of the fence, he hears this voice, 13, 13, 13. He thought, that's odd. And he notices a little knothole's been poked out, and he walks over and he looks through the little knothole. And as he does, a finger jabs him right in the eye. And he walks away holding his eye, and he hears this voice saying, 14, 14, 14. So some things you just have to experience before you understand what it means and the significance of it. Conflict is defined as a disagreement through which the parties involved perceive a threat to their needs, interests, or concerns. Within this simple definition, there are several important understandings that emerge. A conflict is a disagreement. Generally, we are aware that there is some level of differences in the positions of two or more parties involved in the conflict. However, the true differences are many times overshadowed by the perceived differences. Conflict tends to be accompanied by significant levels of misunderstanding that exaggerate the perceived disagreement considerably. So that's a factor in this definition and understanding of conflict. And then it talks about parties involved. It's a disagreement through which the parties involved. And there are often disparities in our sense of who is involved in the conflict. Sometimes people are surprised to learn that they are a party to the conflict, while other times we are shocked to learn that we are not included in the disagreement. On many occasions, people who are seen as part of the social system, whether it's at work or on the team or the company or the family or the church, they're influenced to participate in the dispute, whether they would personally define the situation in that way or not. And in these situations, people very readily take sides based upon current perceptions of the issues, the past issues, and relationships, roles within the organization, other factors. So the parties involved can become an elusive concept to define. And then it talks about a perceived threat. People respond to perceived threats rather than the true threat facing them. Many times in conflict, that's what's at stake, a perceived threat. But here's something that will help you in relationships, if you don't already know this. Your perception is your reality. And if it's not reality to me, I better accept the fact that it is reality to you, because it will complicate our relationship. So rather than be in denial of your perception, which to you is your reality, I must accept the fact that, yes, there's something very real there, and try to navigate through that. So perception doesn't become reality per se, but people's behaviors, their feelings, ongoing responses become modified by that evolving sense of the threat that they confront. So a conflict is a disagreement through which the parties involved perceive a threat to their needs, interests, or concern. Conflict is a part of life. And you say, well, I'm a lover, not a fighter. Well, good luck with that. Because that's not, I wanted to say that's not reality, but if it's your perception, I guess it's your reality. That's what the preacher said. International conflict, cultural conflict, cultures within a nation, organizations, associations, churches, even individuals, local churches, workplace, driving to your work has conflict, traffic jams, families, parents, child, marriage. Read about conflict in this couple in California, a man who hit his wife with a frozen squirrel was jailed on suspicion of spousal abuse, police said. His wife said early Monday morning she had walked into the kitchen and he had taken several frozen squirrels from the freezer. I'd love to eat at this house. And she said I just walked in the room and he started swinging these squirrels around, I guess by their tail, and he let loose one and it struck her in the forehead. And so, conflict. She had this 1-inch cut above her eye. How'd you get that scar? You'll never believe it. Frozen squirrel hit me right in the head. One saint said, to live above with saints we love, 'twill indeed be glory. To live below with saints we know, now that's another story. How do we navigate through conflict? I read about this two men who lived in a small village, and they got into this terrible dispute, and they could not resolve it. So they decided to talk to the town sage. First man went to the sage's home and told his version of what had happened. When he finished, the sage said, "You're absolutely right." The next night, the second man called on the sage and told his side of the story. The sage looked at him and said, "You're absolutely right." Afterward, the sage's wife scolded her husband. "Those men told you two different stories. And you told them they were absolutely right. That's impossible. They can't both be right. And he looked at her and said, "You're absolutely right." He was a wise man. Well, today's narrative takes us to Genesis 13, to conflict. And this is important because in the cycle of events in your life, the distractions that are going to come, a part of those is going to center around this theme of conflict. As I look at chapter 13, the opening verses help me to understand that every conflict has a context. Let's look at it. The context of this situation: they have just returned to Canaan, Abraham and Lot, from Egypt to Bethel, the place where they had been living before they detoured to Egypt. Verse 1, then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. We have here a statement of wealth. It's part of the context here. They've just returned. It's been a stressful situation. But right here in this narrative, there's this statement of wealth. Abraham is wealthy. Abraham has been steadily amassing wealth since he left Ur. He probably was wealthy when he left Ur. He stops in Haran. Remember, it says he takes with him from Haran all of the wealth and all of the souls, probably servants, working class, that he had acquired in Haran. But when we come to this verse, it says Abraham went with Abraham. I don't have the PowerPoint for you, so you have to look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, I guess. Abraham took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all the possessions they had gathered in Haran. They leave, they go to Canaan. When he gets to Egypt, verse 16, it says, the Pharaoh treats him well. He gives him sheep and oxen and male donkeys and all of these animals. Notice the wording of chapter 13, verse 2. It says that Abraham was very rich at this point, where we are today. He's very rich in livestock and in silver and in gold. That's the context of the conflict. Then as we move into this narrative, we come to verses 3 and 4, and we read the choices that affect conflict. He went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. He returns to this place, living between Bethel, which is the house of God, that's what it means, and Ai, which means a heap of ruins. I think it's symbolic of where Abraham is at this point in his life. Could you not agree with that? Somewhere between living in God's will in Canaan and a ruined life in Egypt. What do I do when I find myself there, between Bethel and Ai? Next verse. Abraham comes to the place of the altar, which he made there at first. Guys, I just want to tell you this morning, when you find yourself living between the house of God and a heap of ruins, a good place to go is to the altar. Altars are built to confess sin to God. Altars are built to connect with God. Altars are built to consecrate to God. And I struggled because really I'm stepping ahead of the series here. There's a sermon about the altars, building altars. Abraham built at least 4 altars in his life. There was an altar of reaching for God. There was an altar of relating to God. There was an altar of releasing to God. And that's the altar at Mount Moriah. Those altars need to be in our lives. Abraham goes to this altar, and that's what I need to do. And then he's really what he's doing is he's making choices by coming back and going to the altar. Abraham is realizing, I've made bad decisions, and he's turning it around. As I said, there's a pivotal change in Abraham's life at this point in the story. And those choices that he's making are going to pay off in the verses that follow. Remember, future life circumstances hinge on present day choices. Choices aren't made in a vacuum. Future life circumstances hinge on present day choices. And here's the choice which will affect the coming conflict. Because conflict creates a crisis, right? And here it is. In verse 5, we read, Lot also. Now, that word also links the thought back to verse 2 of Abraham's wealth. Abraham was very rich. And then we come to this. Lot also, who went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. So the conflict context is starting to come together, and we're starting to create this crisis. It's starting to build in our minds as we go through this storyline. Lot has wealth. Now, there's nothing wrong with Lot having wealth. Nothing wrong with him having acquired wealth. But I want you to notice the conflict it causes as revealed in the next verse. But before we go there, I just want to consider this matter with you. Wealth in the life of the Christian. And just make a couple of statements. Wealth in itself is not evil. In fact, it may be an indicator of God's blessings. Psalm 112, verses 2 and 3. The generation of the upright will be blessed. Wealth and riches will be in his house, and his righteousness endures forever. Wealth is also viewed as a result of honest and diligent work. Proverbs 13:11. Wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. So, wealth is not evil. Yes, the scripture warns in many places that wealth, and the desire for wealth, I should say, is the gateway to evil and heartache. 1 Timothy 6 would be one of those. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. 2 Timothy 3, know this, that in the last days, perilous times will come. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money. In fact, it is wealth that is a significant contributing factor to the conflict between Uncle Abraham and his nephew Lot. Abraham was very rich in livestock and silver and gold. Verse 5, Lot also, who went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. The result of this is two critical problems develop, both connected to wealth. The first one is, in verse 6, there's a stock support deficiency. I don't mean Wall Street stock, I mean farmyard stock. Stock support deficiency. Because it says the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. So this is not something that could be avoided. The text says they couldn't. It was impossible. They could not live together. Verse 7 tells us the Canaanites and the Perizzites are also living in the land. So the restructure of the wording of this verse might be something like this. Although Abraham and Lot had been dwelling together, they eventually became so affluent in their possessions of flocks and herds that the land could not support the needs of their livestock, finally reaching a point where they could no longer live together. Conflict arose due to problems with stock support deficiencies. But also there is the second problem of staff dysfunction. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now obviously the livestock needed grazing lands. The competition between Abraham's shepherds and Lot's herdsmen created these apparent irreconcilable tensions. The animals needed watering holes, but due to their increase, there's this shortage of water supply, resulting in short tempers and mounting tensions. Abraham reaches out to Lot to discuss the dilemma. And that brings us to this fourth section in this chapter of communicating through conflict. Look at verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. Communication through conflict. Do you understand that communication in conflict is not easy? But it is oh so essential in maintaining relationships. These guys are family. Relationship matters. Problems occur, but it is communication that addresses the problems while saving the relationship, usually. If the communication is done properly. And in this case, I love the fact that Abraham does it properly. Observe. He starts in this communication process, this is huge, he starts with courtesy. Please, he says, please. Start with courtesy. In conflict, start the dialogue with courtesy. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. You know, I've appreciated our working relationship, or I've appreciated our friendship. Or, I just want to say, first of all, that you are very important to me. And I value you and our relationship together. Don't start with complaints. Don't open the problem resolution meeting with accusations. It will be counterproductive to begin the dialogue with charges of wrongdoing. Rather, start with courtesy. Please. Secondly, in communicating through the conflict, state the importance of the relationship. So Abraham said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsman and your herdsman. Lot, I value our relationship so much that I want to avoid any tensions between us. In conflict, the possibility of resolution is greatly reduced when I come to the meeting with my higher priority being getting my objective met instead of being relationally oriented. I'm objective oriented. If I'm objective oriented, and that shows through, I have really reduced the process, the likelihood of resolution. Objectively oriented. What do you mean by that? Well, meeting my needs, getting my way, and proving that I'm right, humiliating the other person with the wrongdoing, whatever. Abraham doesn't begin the meeting by saying, Lot, you are grazing your flocks in my pastures. Your herdsmen are monopolizing the watering holes. You've got to understand that I have needs too. See, that's objective oriented. He doesn't start that way, does he? It's not in the text. Abraham is relationally oriented. Please, let there be no strife between you and me, no strife between my herdsman and your herdsman. The point in communicating through conflict, start with courtesy. Secondly, state the priority of the relationship. This relationship matters to me. Thirdly, show humility. A humble attitude softens the toughest situation. While there may be occasions in certain conflict situations to assert authority and demonstrate rank by powering up with position, experience, prestige, I just want to suggest that whenever possible, and it's more possible most of the time than we realize, in communicating through conflict, show humility. Power down. If you were to come into my office at Village Park, I was gifted through a gift from hospice, receiving very nice executive office furniture. It's a large executive desk. But if you were to come in to visit with me, unless there's some real reason, significant reason, that I need that desk to be kind of a visible symbol, which has never happened, I'm going to step out from behind that desk, and I'm going to sit beside you, and we're going to talk. I don't want to be facing you from behind the desk, which is the symbol of, could be a symbol of power. I want to come out and sit beside you, alongside you, to be together. Abraham here has the rank. That's obvious. I mean, Lot is the nephew. He is the uncle. Abraham has the power. Whatever Lot is today, he owes much to the kindness and support of his uncle Abraham. I mean, think of it. Abraham has the experience, the experiences, the advantage. For of Lot it is said, he had flocks and herds and tents. But of Abraham it is said, he was very rich in livestock and in silver and in gold. But instead of powering up and pulling rank and pushing his position, Abraham shows humility in communicating through conflict. Abraham said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Do you see that? We are brothers. Up to this point, when the relationship between Abraham and Lot has been referenced, it's always been in the terms of uncle and nephew, right? You remember that? Genesis 11:31, and Terah took Abraham his son and Lot the son of Haran. Genesis 12, verse 5, and Abraham took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son. But here, in the context of conflict, in addressing his brother's son, Abram says to him, we are brothers. Why? I think because Abraham understands that in communicating through conflict, there are at least 3 things to remember. Start with courtesy, state the priority of relationship, show humility. Lot, we're brothers. There's a 4th difficult but important thing that Abraham does in communicating through conflict. It's found in verse 9. Abraham says, Lot, the whole countryside is open to you. Take your choice. Think about this. Take your choice of any section of the land you want, and we will separate. Now, the separation is not because he doesn't love him or care about it. They have to separate. The text has told us that. We will separate. If you want the land to the left, then I'll take the land on the right. If you prefer the land on the right, then I'll go to the left. This is huge right here. I don't know that I ever hear this discussed very much in talking about navigating through conflict. We'll talk about courtesy. We'll talk about the humility. But here's what it is. Abraham submits to providence. In allowing Lot to choose, he submits to providence. You see what's happening here? I told you this guy's growing. Abraham, a guy who in difficult situations has grabbed control, is now becoming the friend of God and learning to walk by faith and obedience. And in this distraction, he's relinquishing control. Abraham is submitting to providence. You say, what do you mean by providence? I mean God. J. Vernon McGee. Anybody remember J. Vernon McGee? It's probably the only sermon I have that quotes J. Vernon McGee. But as I read this quote, I can hear his, you guys have, all the older guys are nodding, yeah. I can hear him through the Bible broadcast. He says, what is providence? Here's a theological definition. Providence is the means by which God directs all things, both animate and inanimate, seen and unseen, good and evil, toward a worthy purpose, which means his will must finally prevail. As the psalmist said, his kingdom ruleth over all. In Ephesians 1:11, Paul tells us that God worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. Our God is running the universe today, friends. Can't you hear Jay Vernon say that? Friends. Our God is running the universe. Even though there are some who think that it has slipped out from under him, providence means that the hand of God is in the glove of human events. When God is not at the steering wheel, he is the backseat driver. He is the coach who calls the signals from the bench. Providence is the unseen rudder on the ship of state. God is the pilot at the wheel during the night watch. As someone has said, he makes great doors swing on little hinges. J. Vernon McGee. It is all about faith. Hebrews has told us that over and over this week. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And when the distraction in your life is conflict in relationship, yes, there must be these earlier processes and these steps in communicating that we've talked about. But you need to go in realizing that there is an overarching, sovereign, providential God who cares deeply about this person and cares deeply about my situation. And I don't have to be God here. I don't have to manipulate and orchestrate and pull this or be political here. I can just let God be God. That requires significant faith in saying, Lord, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'm going to trust you. Doing so requires that I recognize a couple of things. That I recognize that vengeance or justice ultimately belongs to God. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. In submitting to providence, I realize I don't have to enact vengeance. It's God's. Its justice is his. I secondly need to rest in the assurance that my life belongs to God. He is committed to my care. I can trust him. And guys, I just want to tell you that you can trust God with your life. If he would send his son Jesus, I mean, think about it. If he would send his son Jesus from heaven to do what he did, don't you think he loves you? Well, Paul seemed to think so. That's why he said he proved beyond any possible doubt that he loved us when while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Rest in the assurance that God is for me. I mean, Psalm 118 says it like this, the Lord is on my side. I will not fear what man can do to me. In submitting to the providence of God, it means that I release the decisions and the actions of others to God, who is their master and the one to whom they will give an account. Remember Peter in the New Testament? He was always wanting to make sure everything was just right. And one time, Jesus was talking to John, and Peter said, well, Lord, what about him? What's going to happen here? And Jesus said, you don't worry about him. You just, I got this. I got this, Peter. You don't worry about him. I got it. In communicating through conflict, Abraham chooses to, and I must choose to, submit to providence. And it means that I release the decisions and the actions of others to God. I believe this submission to providence is what helps Abraham in the context of conflict and to make the choices that he does here. Well, what happened? Is there life after conflict? Sure there is. Verses 10 through 13. Let's look at it. Lot lifted his eyes. Here's decision time for Lot. Lot lifts his eyes and he saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Like the garden of the Lord, don't miss this phrase, like the land of Egypt. You know why that's there? Because the only time Lot ever saw Egypt is when his uncle Abraham took him there. And Lot's thinking, wow, this looks like Egypt over there, and I really liked Egypt. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan. And Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Lot's made an awful choice. As for Abraham, I love this. Lot's just left. And the Lord said to Abraham, lift up your eyes now. Look from the place where you're standing. Look northward. Look southward. Look east, look west. For all the land which you see, I'm going to give to you and to your descendants. Wait a minute. Isn't that Lot that I see walking into the horizon in the same direction you told me to look? Didn't he just choose that for himself? And now, God, you're telling me after he's chosen and I've lost the best, you're telling me now that you're going to give that to me? God says, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do it even more. I'm going to make your descendants as the dust of the earth. So that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. I want you to get up from here, Abraham. Walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. See how you can trust God? You can submit to God's providence even when someone is abusing a situation, and I don't mean physical, sexual abuse. I mean, even when someone is taking advantage of you and they're not showing humility, but you are, and you're like, God, this isn't right. God knows that. Submit to God's providence. He's got this. I'm going to do this for you, Abraham. Verse 8, I really like this. Then Abraham moves his tent, and he went and dwelt by the terebinth tree of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And he built an altar there to the Lord. Remember when we began today? Remember where Abraham was living? Between Bethel and Ai, the house of God and the heap of ruins. That's where he was living. But at the end of the story, because of his choices made in the context of conflict, Abraham moves to a new place. Verse 18, Abraham moves his tent to live in a place called Hebron. You know what that means? It means the place of fellowship. Lot's living near the exceedingly wicked men of Sodom and Gomorrah. But Abraham is living in a place of fellowship with God. If you're living between God's will and a ruined life, could it be that conflict has caused or is causing the dysfunction, the ruin that you now experience? Well, today God's Word has taught us how to move through the context of conflict by starting the communication process with courtesy. As we communicate, we must not begin the dialogue by accusing, complaining, or creating a wish list of what I want, but I need to state the priority of relationship. More than anything, your relationship with me matters. Doing so will mean that I must show humility, not power up, but humble myself. And that ultimately requires me to submit to the providence of God for what comes next. And when I do this, I will experience the indescribable peace that comes in the future tomorrows because of the present day choices that I make in the context of conflict. I pray that God will help you and me to remember this example of navigating through conflict in the journey of becoming a friend of God.